John, all yours.
Well, thank you very much. And we know we're standing between you and coffee breaks, so we might actually try and get our chat done in 10 minutes so that coffee is available for those who need it. Well, you had a great introduction, even as a man who needs no introduction. Perhaps you could give us a truncated journey through Australia's evolution in the global position of our blockchain industry and how we've stacked up, just for the audience. A quick run through. You can get your own microphone.
Sure. The conversation started many years ago. They started optimistically. People talked about technology and the hope that they had. And I think back in 2017, I started to say to people, I see the creeping fog of regulation. And everyone said, we don't have to worry about regulation. This technology fixes everything. You flash forward 6 years and it's not a fog. It descended. In between, I think we've ridden the waves, much like the technology has from a speculative perspective and I think a financial sort of success perspective. It's the hype train that's come and gone, turns around and comes back again. So I've watched these patterns emerge, Michael, and I'm as optimistic as I've ever been, but invariably for different reasons. And I think the biggest challenge that we've had over the last 5 or 6 years has been we started talking at people, all of us. Regulators talk at you, industry talks at you, academics talk at you. Everyone has a view, and we're always really frustrated that no one takes our view on at the same time as we're trying to convince them of our own views. So with that context, I think what I've observed is an industry that has made its way in this space and assumptions that have come too quickly of those who have visited and not stayed, which is you read some headlines, you ask your colleagues, and they'll come back to you and invariably say, I have a very firm view, which is almost impossible to unshackle. And so that context is because of the way the personalities have sort of driven things. What I've found from a political perspective is there was no interest at all. And then there was an observation of what was happening overseas. When the former government was in power, there was hardly any interest. There was one senator who ultimately showed some interest and attention. And to his credit, he spoke when few others would. And I think the reason he did that is because he was in the Senate without a portfolio and effectively unshackled. So he was able to follow his interest. And for that reason, he spoke his mind and he drew people in. And that in and of itself drew more politicians in. So again, we start with the premise that we'll be able to convince people. He found his way through the space. He brought attention to it. Others saw some merit into it. And they came towards the subject matter. And then, as is the case for almost everybody, there was a change of government. And it starts back often at the same spot where you have to convince one person that this is something you should do and you need to upskill those people. So I don't get frustrated in that sense. And I think with the government as it exists today, they came into power. They hadn't invested an enormous amount of time in this subject matter because it wasn't a top 10 agenda item. So you're starting once again with that process of what are the priorities? So you have this practical overlay that makes technology adoption very difficult because when you've been out of government for a long time and you come in, you've got a lot of people who supported you when you're in the wilderness. So you've got a lot of people that come to you and say, listen, we were there in the bad times. We're ready to be there in the good times. So they're sort of the counterpoints, I think, to the technology case and the use case. It says you need to build confidence and you need to build relationships one by one.
And then having gone through that history, and I've also seen it similar length in the industry as you, but on the legal side. So I suppose I can speak and say that I've seen that evolution as well from the Cambrian explosion of, I hate the word Wild West, but more just huge, everyone doing everything and all kinds of amazing projects trying to start up and then a big drop off. And I think Australia's done quite well through the, bear markets. I suppose are a good measure of recession style thing for crypto globally or blockchain innovation globally, although during that we still saw the larger consortia moving along and some fade away and some of those big projects perhaps not go in the direction that would have been hoped and run into challenges. But I think Australia has kept building. On the reg side, we've seen obviously about, effectively I think 5 or 6 proper inquiries and huge amounts of submissions put on by industry. So we probably have a pretty decent wealth of industry feedback and thought leadership that's gone to the government and is all available online, which is, I think, probably globally puts us a little bit better than some jurisdictions because it's coalesced over time to some really key points and identifying the key risk factors that face users and trying to address those, whereas some perhaps larger jurisdictions have had even more noise and voices and submissions in there and have ended up with much bigger regulatory outcomes like MICA as a result, and whatever the heck will eventually come in the US if one solution ever comes through at all, which creates, I suppose, a bit more of a chaotic comment. I think it was Mitchell made a comment earlier about the number of DeFi projects that came out of Australia. What do you think about that overrepresentation of Australian founders and people working in the space that we've seen emerge as it relates to the global position now?
I think it's definitely the case that people say Australians, not Australia. I think people say Singapore and not necessarily Singaporeans. There's a sense of jurisdictions and their sort of impact. You know, I spent a lot of time this year traveling, and in the US, they know Singapore and they know what Singapore is doing, and they have a view of what Hong Kong and China is doing. And they view them as ecosystems, whereas Australians, I think because we have a tendency, because we're on the other side of the world, to venture out, you get to know the Australian who's building things much more than you know the Australian ecosystem. And that's a strength and a weakness. And when you look at something like MICA, it was interesting that when I was in the US and they talked about MICA, it was a monolithic description. No one said these countries, they said MICA. So you're finding all these sort of geopolitical sort of interactions and interplays where countries are viewed in particular sort of settings. And in Australia's, I think in the positive sense, we're viewed as a mature ecosystem, which has a very sensible regulatory framework. Are we fast moving? We are not. And are we likely to move super fast with this? We are not. We're just not. You know, we're going to orient towards jurisdictions, I think, that are sort of good examples of our own kind of legal kind of historical reflections. UK looks similar. We pay attention to them. The US, you can't help but pay attention to the US. And one of the regulatory realities is when you're talking about IOSCO guidance, when you're talking about the coordination of organisations like ASIC in Australia and the SEC in the US, they coordinate much more effectively because they have a much more limited mandate with respect to the things they're being asked to do. Whereas when you go to organisations like Treasury, and you said Chloe there championed the case for years, they're trying to find a way through a much more complicated maze. Whereas if you're an enforcement agency, primarily you'll say, we just don't want things to go wrong, so let's stop them from going wrong. Whereas when you're working in an organisation like Treasury, you're saying, how can we make the case for jobs and growth and innovation and temper the risks that are consumer protections? And that's a much more difficult path to go through. And that's something that we've done in fits and starts. And I'm confident that at the moment, given some of the conversations that I'm having and I'm hearing at the top of government, there's a recognition that we need to cut away some of the elements that are viewed as either nefarious or bad actors or just don't suit the profile of the development of the local ecosystem, and then see what's left. And I say to people, frankly, because when I go into other jurisdictions, Michael, everyone's jurisdiction looks like it's the most wonderful of places. Everyone looks from afar. I joke often that it looks like grass over the fence, but it's usually just concrete painted green. Everywhere you go, every jurisdiction I go to, I get told, yeah, that bit's good, but here are our problems. So people aren't saying it's all fantastic, you should come. Everyone has their challenges, but I think we're reasonably well set, contingent, the asterisks, that we move from here. I think the risk has been we're going to fall behind, but I actually think in some respects, the language around Singapore, talking blockchain, not crypto as an example from last year, that brings us closer. It doesn't mean we stay close, but it says there's a slowing of some of the initiatives in regions and jurisdictions that we like to consider ourselves akin to. And so that gives me hope most mornings.
Well, building on that, you mentioned, you're seeing, I suppose, a split off of the areas that have been viewed as less desirable, nefarious, or breaking of laws. And of course, many have probably seen the news overnight of CZ stepping down from Binance and Binance having a potentially gargantuan settlement. Do you see that as the SEC just getting warmed up, a closing of the chapter of this kind of activity in the past where there just were problems, less rules, or they were disregarded, and now a signal that it's growing up, or something in between? And I'll only just add on the side, we also saw ASIC release their enforcement priorities last year, of which had a very, very prominent high-risk crypto asset products, not mentioned at all on this year's enforcement priorities. I was sort of reading it yesterday, trying to think which one of these enforcement priorities might put crypto products underneath, and I was struggling to find which one they might be squeezed underneath. But in that kind of context, do you see that more as a closing the book maturity, or do you see it as a regulation by enforcement increasing, or where does it land?
The US is such a monster market, and everyone always gives lip service to the fact it's a monster market. They can get most things wrong and still win. And so they can choose a much narrower path and still win. So what you see on the other side of the conversation at the moment, in a positive sense, ETF applications effectively in parts of this ecosystem being consolidated and being given some ticks by big financial players. That's the US just moving, this hulking beast moving. For me, you need then to juxtapose what other jurisdictions can do. And the risk in jurisdictions like Australia and across the region, across in Asia Pacific, is if you wait for the US to get their version right, then it's not worth running that race. They will win that race. And so I see that creeping in a positive way forward. But when I spoke to people in the US, it was rare that people said we're leaving the US and not coming back. What they were saying is we're going to press pause here and go somewhere until we come back. In jurisdictions like Australia, it's much harder to get people to come back once they've gone. And that's one of the challenges I think that people need to get their head around. From a government perspective, I think historically geography has been both a saviour and a curse. And for us now, once people go, the notion that you need to come back in a world that is largely now remote, where technology is borderless, you just don't have to come back. And that's a very difficult message to sell within organisations, let alone within government. And historically, over the last 5 or 6 years, every time I go into an organisation, they say, where's the blockchain and where's the crypto? Regulators said the same thing. And when I was in the previous role and I dealt with a lot of the regulators with respect to this subject matter, I would say it intersects those topics. You know, this is not a vertical conversation. This is digital assets, digital payments, identity. It's cross-border. It's AML, and they sort of went, yeah, but people do that individually. They go, this technology does not care how you've previously sort of allocated it. So that's a common challenge for me, regionally and globally, not unique to us. And so, from my perspective, I think the easy way to deal with it is just to. And what's the old joke about an elephant? How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. It's a very slow process, but you'll get through that elephant eventually.
Other than the one bite at a time, what do you think Australia could do to better be recognised as Australia versus Australians globally in this space?
Signals matter. I mean, that's one of the conversations I've had often. You don't have to do as much as you think you need to in order to get attention. People are looking for green shoots. They're looking for positivity. And so brand Australia has to do that. That's not an individual business. You know, we can speak to individual businesses, but largely you notice a brand, but if you go to America and talk about Atlassian, for argument's sake, you probably need to remind them it's an Australian business. They just, they're judged on the merits of the business and what they're otherwise doing. So I think the best thing to happen from a government perspective, and I think we're seeing this in Hong Kong at the moment, Brand Hong Kong has said open for business. Now, when I was there, I said to people, what version of business is it? They said, we're not sure. All we know is there's a strong message and it's consistent that there is an open mind with respect to where this technology goes. That's what people are sort of gravitating towards. And I think that's where nations tend to win, is you need to convince someone to say, stand up, own it. And I know when it comes to conversations within state governments in particular, and I'll say, whose responsibility is their subject matter? And they say it hasn't been allocated. I said, until it's allocated, no one will care. Everyone needs to know there's a door that ultimately is the one that leads you into a conversation about this. So unless you get to that point where you say this person, it's their portfolio, it's their topic, then it tends to go nowhere. So the signal, which is in my mind, Michael, it's actually the easiest bit, but it's also the bit that people are most reticent to sort of do. Some of the big financial businesses that you and I know, they've said to me, we can't talk about this subject matter. It's like, why not? I said, because then people ask us questions which we're not equipped to answer. So they don't even have the conversation. And that's the same for government and sort of the brands that are associated with countries.
I did say we do 10 minutes, but we're a little bit over. But I'm also mindful of, again, not being in the way of people's coffee, and also thankful for those who've joined online throughout today as well, including this session.
It's my opportunity. Keep going. Yeah.
Well, I was gonna wrap us up there so you can get your caffeine on.
Awesome. All right, everyone. I think it's most important for the international guests to speak to these two gentlemen right here at Coffee, because Australia is a very unique country with some of the largest fund management flows, largest wholesale flows in the world. Fifth traded currency in the world. It is not an area to sideline, but equally the innovation here is sprouting, but it does need to be exported most of the time. And these two gentlemen have been critical to this industry in this country. So I say let's break for coffee for 15 minutes. Let's regroup at 22, so it's 3:40, and then from there we'll get into more around BGIN's organization. This organization itself has gone so far so quickly. We'll be having the next block meeting in Tokyo in March, And it'd be amazing to have everyone there, have your participation, and equally make actions off of all the documents we've created and all the workshops. So again, just want to say thank you to the gentleman here,